The origins of paddle carving go way, way back, nearly to the dawn of human history. Paddle making is more than just utilitarian. Many cultures and many carvers have made paddle shaping and paddle decoration an art of its own. By making your own paddle, you will be following in the footsteps of hundreds of thousands, helping to maintain and to carry forward an ancient craft. Paddling is a great way to relax and have fun. It can lead to many wilderness adventures. Make your next canoe trip more fulfilling by adding the satisfaction of using a paddle you have made yourself. The stages in carving a paddle are 1. The selection of a pattern and a suitable piece of wood. 2. Cutting out the paddle blank, which is often done by someone other than the carver. 3. Shaping the paddle with hand tools. And 4. Sanding, decorating, and varnishing. Some of the tools you may want to use are C-clamps, a sharpening stone, certainly a spoke shave, smoothing and or block planes, a cabinet scraper, sanding blocks, rulers and gauges, and perhaps a jigsaw. For finishing your paddle, you will need thinner, tack rags, a good quality spar varnish, a bristle or foam brush, sandpaper, fine steel wool, and a sanding block. There are several popular ways to measure for a comfortable paddle length. Many people like a paddle that reaches from the floor to somewhere between their chin and their nose. Paddle length preferences also depend on the type of boat used and on paddling position. For solo, you would probably want a shorter paddle than for paddling tandem in the bow or stern. Enthusiasts often acquire several paddles in a lifetime for different purposes. First, decide what kind of paddle you want to make. Most people choose either a beaver tail or an otter tail for their first carving project. If you are looking for a shallow or white water paddle, you will probably want to laminate it using several different woods in order to take advantage of their best properties. You can use one of the patterns supplied with this video and modify that design, or simply trace around a paddle you have used in the past that you especially like. Now you need to find a suitable board to make the paddle from. Either kiln-dried or air-dried is fine. Weight, strength, durability, and appearance are key considerations. Some of the woods you can choose from are cherry, ash, mahogany, oak, basswood, cedar, and maple. Your board must be a full 1 1/4 inches thick, and for most patterns, 6 inches wide. It is critically important to have knot-free, straight grain lines in the shaft area.
We have here a piece of black cherry. It's been air-dried about 4 years. It should be really easy to work with hand tools. I picked up this board because of the interesting grain pattern on this end of the board. It's a similar shape to the blade of the paddle. But when we turn this board over, this big knot appears, which will end up right where the shaft of the paddle will be. Here we have another piece of cherry. It's probably not as interesting as the last piece we looked at, but as a paddle blank, it's a better piece of wood. If you look at the area in here where the shaft of the paddle will be, the grain direction is fairly consistent. Checking the other side, we see one small pin knot up here, but I don't believe that'll be a problem. We can position our patterns so that we can work around that. I would like to get the shaft of the paddle to follow down this grain pattern here. It'll give us a very interesting figure on the grip, and you'll also see a little bit of figure on the edge of the paddle. To do that, I'm going to lay the paddle pattern roughly in position and mark where the center line is on the ends. And then we'll join that with a straight edge just to be sure that it's going down that part of the grain that we want to see in the middle of the shaft. In order to be sure that both sides of the paddle are symmetrical, do all the tracing off one side of the paddle pattern.
Here we have an expert woodworker cutting his paddle blank using a bandsaw. You could also do this with a jigsaw. You can skip this step by purchasing a ready-made paddle blank from a specialty supply shop. Usually these blanks are pre-carved on all surfaces, and this substantially reduces the time it takes to complete your project.
The next thing to do is to transfer this center line to the back of the side of the paddle. I'll use a tri-square to project that line straight across to the back. Do that on both ends of the paddle. And join those marks with a straight edge. Now we need to get a reference line that goes around the outside edge. And I'm going to use a marking gauge to do this. You could use it, just your finger as a gauge. This will be a little more accurate. That's how you do it with your finger. This is a marking gauge. You can see the scale on here. We've set that scale for half the width of the paddle blank. You'll notice that there's a little nail pin sort of thing coming through, and that will scribe the line in the edge of the paddle blank. Next thing to mark out is where the shaft begins to taper down to become the grip. I'm going to project that across by eye. Going to be close enough. And then sketching in the shape of the grip onto the side of the blank.
Now comes one of the most enjoyable stages of carving a paddle, using a traditional spoke shave. You will want a good, sharp one. To properly sharpen your spoke shave, you may want to use a sharpening stone. Apply a little light oil to float away the cuttings. Now, hold the blade with thumb and forefinger. Rub back and forth, keeping your hands and wrists relatively rigid, making the movements with your arms and shoulders. Turn the blade over on its back. A few passes on this side will remove the burr that has built up. Touch the new edge to your fingernail. If it scrapes effectively, your blade is sharp. An alternate way to sharpen a spoke shave blade is to use 240 to 400 wet dry sandpaper taped to a piece of glass. This technique is fast and produces an extra sharp, slightly serrated edge. Now the shaping begins. There are several ways to clamp your paddle for carving. You will be able to see other techniques of clamping in this video as you watch. Here, the carver uses a smoothing plane for the early stages of shaping the blade. As the work progresses, he will change to a block plane and then to the spoke shave. Remove the wood on both sides until the center area of the blade is about 3/8 of an inch thick. As the carving continues, you will need to shave towards the edges until they reach 3/16 of an inch thick. When you have finished the wide surface of the blade to your satisfaction, you can use the block plane, spoke shave, and sanding block to shape and finish the edges. Now we will work on the grip. By carving the shaft last, you will preserve a good clamping surface, and you will be able to hold the paddle firmly in a vise while working on each end. You need to be conscious of the direction of the grain as you work around the handle. Carefully watch this expert at work. You may want to adjust the amount of blade exposure on the spoke shave in order not to have it gouge or chatter. Keep your blade sharp. Now you will want to use a cabinet scraper. This will remove carving marks and help the contours flow together. But first you will want to know how to sharpen this specialized tool. Clamp your scraper in a padded vise and file off the old burr with a fine mill file. Now file the top with smooth, straight strokes until you can feel a slight burr on the edge. Finally, roll the edge of the new burr over with a burnishing tool or the hardened steel shaft of a screwdriver. Burnishing rolls the burr, giving you a small hook that makes for an aggressive, easy-to-control scraping tool. It is a good idea at this point to scrape both the blade and the handle, because you can still clamp the paddle easily with a vise. Now you need to finish the shaft. Be very careful to pad the vise so as not to damage the finished portions of the paddle with pressure marks. Your next step is to add 2 additional guidelines on each surface of the shaft so that you can carve 4 additional faces, making it octagonal. Using a plane, proceed to carve until the shaft is 8-sided. Now use a spoke shape to round the shaft, or as some prefer, make it oval. Do the final touch-up with a spoke shave to blend the shaft with the handle and blade. Now, sand the entire paddle with 80 and 120 grit sandpaper, using a flexible block where contours are involved. After this, you will want to wet your paddle with water to raise the grain. When it dries and feels like a 1 day's growth of beard, sand it again with 120 and 220 grit sandpaper. Wipe the paddle with a tack rag to remove any dust. A tack rag is a lint-free cheesecloth moistened with a mixture of varnish and thinner to make it sticky. These are available from your paint store, or you can make one yourself. Now you need to seal the wood. This is usually done with thinned varnish, following the instructions on the can for applying a first coat. You will need to put a small screw hook in the handle end of your paddle so that you can hang it up to varnish the last little bit and leave it. When the varnish is dry, sand it lightly with 220 grit sandpaper. If you have an artistic flair, you may want to add some kind of design to your paddle at this stage. Randy Knott, an artist from Curve Lake, Ontario, provides a lovely example of what a little inspiration can accomplish. Wipe your paddle again lightly with a tack rag and proceed to apply a full-bodied coat of varnish. You will want to pay close attention to the degree of resistance behind the brush as you work, in order to obtain a smooth, even coat. High resistance means the varnish is too lightly applied, and minimum resistance means that you are putting on too much and that you will get runs. Normally, you would apply 4 coats if you were using a paintbrush and 5 if you were using a foam brush. Sand lightly and use a tack rag between each coat. Allow your paddle to dry in a dust-free environment. You now have a beautiful finished paddle of your own making. It should give you satisfaction to know that you are following in the footsteps of hundreds of generations of paddle carvers. Your new paddle should also provide you with years of pleasure.